Welcome, thank you. And so this is our first session for underrepresented voices of the American Revolution. And we have a great panel here. We have Professor Bob Allison from Suffolk University. And he also teaches at the Harvard Extension School. And then we have Charlie Newhall, St. John's Preparatory High School over in Danvers, and also a member of the New England History Teachers Association. And then we have here our special guest, Ray Raphael, who's been teaching for quite some time, teaching U.S. history, right? High school, elementary school, correct? And it was
middle school, high school, college, any level. Yeah,
right.
Anyone I find in the streets, whatever works. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Ray wrote this book back in 2001, right? People's History of the American Revolution: How Common People Have Shaped the Fight for Independence. And so welcome. Thank you for being here. And why don't we just begin with just talking a bit about yourself, and I guess one of my questions to you was the impetus and the premise of your work, and how you came to writing this book.
Well, I can answer both those questions in together. A little bit about myself and how I came to write this book, because it goes deep. It goes. I was actually involved in the peace and civil rights movement in the '60s, and in particular, for instance, on all levels. But when I went south in the civil rights in summer of '62, and then Mississippi Freedom Summer in '64, I witnessed a mass movement, a bottom-up movement, just an amazing grassroots movement. And this was the time civil rights was becoming really big, and it was all Martin Luther King and his followers, and that's not what I was seeing. What I was seeing was just down-home people, just doing their thing. And they had actually been active for years, the locals there, but now they were getting national attention. And I rubbed up against just some amazing people, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the field secretaries there, and the work they did going out to the plantations, they still called them plantations, and trying to register people to vote. And actually on the first day there, I wound up in the house of Fannie Lou Hamer.
Oh.
Yeah, and Fannie Lou Hamer, for those who, as you hear this, if you're playing this on your computer, why don't you just pause this program and go look up Fannie Lou Hamer and try to get her speech at the 1964 Democratic Convention, where she was trying to unseat the all-white Democratic Mississippi Party. We were the COHO, the Committee of Federated Organizations, and seat the Freedom Democratic Party, which was open to everyone, not just blacks or whites or whatever. And it's just an amazing thing. She's just, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And anyway, that was the first night in Mississippi. I spent at her house with Stokely Carmichael of SNCC, who later was a big Black Power fellow, and Charlie Cobb, the kind of barefoot poet of the movement. And then we went to visit Amzie Moore, who if you look him up, you might not find very much, but he was a very local activist for NAACP. And that's just the way it was. It was this grassroots movement, and we were down there. These intruders from the north, basically to get national attention to these people, and so that was our job within it, and we kind of did our job. We did help get national attention, but what I was seeing was a local grassroots movement, and ever since then, I've just seen how and look at the profound effect that it had. Mm-hmm. It was just amazing, but that initiated from the bottom up. So I kind of understood what we call bottom up history. A few years later, I actually moved out to the country, and I'm in this totally foreign world. I grew up in New York, and I'm going in this brushland in California where I can see the Pacific Ocean, and I'd say, what's going on here? And so I started writing what was going on here over the years, and that became my first book. It was called An Everyday History of Somewhere. And it was being the history of Indians, loggers, potatoes, deer, salmon, everything just from the bottom up. And pretty much that's kind of like shaped my consciousness about history and how people worked and just about human life. You know, I mean, we're all people, and that's what it is. And then so anyway, I wrote a lot of local books about this area, and I was teaching, and I was trying to develop a kind of a experimental curriculum on American history, critical thinking curriculum, where you look at it from 3 different perspectives. And I said, okay, let's try this out. So I think I'll just try it out with the American Revolution. So I started studying the American Revolution, and that basically, that's as far as I got. Because once you set foot in late 18th century America, citizenship. I have dual citizenship in California in 2019, and in 1770s and 1780s in the East Coast of the United States. And so I started looking from that kind of bottom-up perspective. You know, what was it like for ordinary people? And I actually got an NEH grant to pursue this, and that wound up. You say my book, you know, I wrote it in 2001. Well, not exactly. I wrote it from from 1995 to 2001, and yeah, that was the longest book, because also I was starting from scratch. You see, by now, I'm not one of these people who, like, you know, have always been fascinated by the revolution. I was just interested in history, and I kind of happened to start there and never progressed any farther. But anyways, when I started looking at what was already collected, already written, it turns out, starting in the 1960s, from the very perspective that I had, people had started talking about studying the revolution from the bottom up. That's actually a phrase that Jesse Lemich introduced, and it became current. And then there were several. There was actually evolving a great scholarship about that. Several scholars and delving into the various aspects of it. So basically, I started looking first into the secondary sources, and my method in history is when you tackle a new field, you start with whatever you can find, which is usually secondary sources, and then the key thing you do is you go to the references, you know, and then you just go. You start from the general, and then references, and then that sends you deeper and deeper and deeper until you wind up with the archival work, and that's where you really get the down and dirty, what's really happening, basically primary sources, and you can develop your own kind of bottom up history of bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when you think about history from the bottom up, I'm thinking about new social history and all the data that's driven new social history, uncovering all kinds of new things, whether it's tax records, whether it's probate court, the same thing, other versions of that. That seemed to drive a lot of new social history, and also there's a politics to new social history and to history from the bottom up. And I wonder if how those 2 aspects of new social history informed what you did. Were they things that you were creating? Who were you looking to as models for that? Because in the end, what you produce is, I think, a wonderful narrative. Your chapter on slavery, Liberty to Slaves, is just, I think, really accessible for my AP U.S. history kids. It tells the story of Thailand, for example, and how can you think of the Boston Massacre the same way after you've read that section on Tybee Island? And I wonder where you're going to. What are your models for that, and how data figures into your process?
Data fit in relatively not that much. It really was more the personal stories, the people. It was anchored in the people. And I have to say, I'm going to backtrack a little to my earlier work, which the everyday history. I wound up basically, there were all kinds of interview with old timers. What's the kid from New York going to say about life in the backwoods of North Carolina? So I have to go to the people, and I get the people, and I started right away, tape recording, try to get the diction right, transcribing, And then I wrote other books about this area, like I wrote a couple of books about the timber industry. What would I do? I'd go to the people. I'd talk to timber executives, environmentalists, horse loggers, balloon loggers, all sorts of different people involved. And it was always people-based, and kind of like the ultimate from the ground up is people, individual experiences and how their experiences it. And we're going to get to this later, what kind of choices people make. That's really where I've gotten with this. And so that's really where it went. So I was really looking for the stories, and the stories I was trying to get from, as close to the primary source as possible. I am going to add here one thing that at that time, when I came out with this, 2001, there had really evolved two kind of competing schools of history of the revolution. One was the school that I was kind of known to be in, people's history, bottom-up history. And for instance, the book was endorsed by Howard Zinn. I had never met him before, except I knew his work in the movement because he was part of the civil rights movement. And my first knowledge of Howard Zinn was the great book he wrote about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that was the first book that actually, treated the civil rights movement from the bottom up. And so, but he saw the book and he liked it, and so he kind of endorsed it, and I was kind of identified with that group. The other group was, we called it somewhat derisively, founder chic. And these were the biographies, best-selling biographies of the famous, usually the big six, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Madison, and Franklin, and Hamilton. And these were very popular. And what I really realized is that this is a total situation where you need them both. To understand history, you have to understand how power flows up and down social and political hierarchies. There are decisions that are made at the top that that's the way they're made. And somebody has to decide, sign the paper and do this or that. And the laws are passed. But there's great pressure from the bottom. And then the people at the top have to respond or not respond to that pressure. And unless you're looking at the dynamic of how power goes up and down these social and political hierarchies, you're not getting a full picture. But certainly, to anchor that picture, you don't get anything. If you just do nothing but talk about the big people, you don't get it. You get a bunch of people standing in the room saying stuff. I mean, it's just not happening. Where's the action? Who's actually doing everything? Now, when I'm talking about people's history too, I'm not talking about some sort of affirmative action program. Oh, we have to look at these people who, the Native Americans and the women and so on, because they deserve to be looked at because we want to be fair and politically correct. That's not it. The thing is, history works that way. And every week we'll be going through these people, these groups one at a time. But if you want to understand what's happening in the complex world of the American Revolution, you have to know what's happening on all of those levels and from all of those people, because all of them are contributing in consequential ways and making very consequential decisions on an individual level, how things are going to go. Well, underrepresented basically means, I'm not talking about underrepresentation in Congress or something at this point. I'm talking about underrepresentative in the core narrative. And often I refer to the core narrative, and certainly this is something I've heard to a lot when I wrote the book Founding Myths, which actually emerged from people's history. And you really see the core narrative, you can follow it through time by looking at the textbooks and the popular histories, which actually for Founding Myths, because of Founding Myths, I did. There's a great library part of Harvard that has all the old textbooks, so you can go and read them through the through the years. And if you look at the textbooks, I mean, you're going to see a whole lot of now you read about, in the common narrative, you read about Sally Hemings, but you didn't read about Sally Hemings, you just read about Thomas Jefferson, 50 years ago. And so the core narrative evolves. And what I mean by underrepresented, I'm basically taking that as a pivot point in time before this movement started happening, this movement that started in the late 60s, started picking up steam, 70s, 80s, 90s. And honestly, my people's history, there is one area where that I did deep archival research, and that led to 2 other books, which we can talk about later. But other than that, most of this was a compilation of basically a generation of deep historical research. And so, and when that happened, and then gradually, starting really around that time and a lot in the last 20 years since people's history, these underrepresented people are not so underrepresented anymore. There's been a great push for a more complete representation. And really, if you look at books 20 years ago and books today, you're going to see a huge change. Textbooks, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to get that there, you're really going to have to start breaking it down, because there's no such person as a common person. You know, I mean, a person's something, right? You know, and what makes him common? Well, I don't know, he's like his brother or something. I mean, you know, I mean, it's kind of a generic term. It's kind of a placeholder term for basically the unrepresented people. But they're people who are not usually noted for being of great historical consequence, and so you really have to break that down. You know, like, and that's, you know, so I kind of cover. I have 8 chapters 6 chapters here, and some of them actually deal with several different groups. But like, for instance, the first chapter, rank and file rebels, and we hear about these popular protests, starting with the Stamp Act protests in 1765, and certainly that was very. The bulk of that really came from urban crowds. These were the people who were making those protests, and people who are, if you're going to, aren't you going to Boston later? And
yeah.
So, you know, the Freedom Trail, you know, and all that, and you know, to pay some attention to that corner of Washington Street there, where they have the Liberty Tree, you know, and the story of the Liberty Tree. That's a common people story. It's great, and so there had been quite a bit of work on urban crowds, actually. Gary Nash did a book called The Urban Crucible, and that really got into the you know, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, the common people, and the role that those people played mostly in the coming of the revolution. What I found here, remember I said that I start with secondary sources and then move deeper. So I started seeing a few sort of fleeting references to rural unrest in Western Massachusetts and crowd actions in Western Massachusetts. So, well, you know, I'm studying common people. Hey, I better look into that though. What's going on? And so what I found out, I got deeper and deeper and deeper into the archival research, and I'm looking at all the minutes of these committees of correspondence. By the way, in terms of common people, my gosh, the committees of correspondence, that was in every town in Massachusetts. You know, a couple of hundred towns had these committees of correspondence, and they were connected with the town meetings. They were kind of the radical arm of the town meeting, and they were given official standing within the town meetings. And this is a good example of by the top down and bottom up, because that idea started in Boston. You know, with Boston, Samuel Adams and so on, and they put out the letter. But the response they got was so overwhelming, and soon, within a year of that happening, the people in rural Massachusetts were taking the lead, and the people in Boston were saying, "Don't go so fast. You got to slow down." Mm-hmm. So anyway, so what I find, I started going down, and I find, like, you know, the big find really was in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I see this the Ebenezer Parkman diary, and he chronicles, and his son Brett was at the demonstration, you know, the overthrow of the courts there, and there's 4,622 militiamen, half the adult male population of Worcester County. Half the population of a adult male population of a rural county gathers in one place, you know, and this is from the New Hampshire line to the Rhode Island line, and on one day. and unseats the British court. And it actually shows, I have this on my website, by the way, you can actually see the diary, and he chronicles the order of the towns as they stood along Main Street and forced the judges to take off their hats, recite their recantations 30 times each as they go through the line. And this is not just like a rural unrest, they unseated British authority. And this is a great example of how the work of common people just gets, just not known. Like all this stuff about, the Boston this and that, and here they actually unseated British authority in Worcester and in every other rural county, every other county in Massachusetts. We're talking 1774, by the way, a year and a half before Lexington conquered, 1774. Remember that. And what they're really pissed off about is that it's not the closing of Boston. Yeah, they were upset with that, but that wasn't like the game changer. But that's what you used to read in all the textbooks. It was just, Boston had trouble and they all came to Boston's support. Oh, poor Boston, we will help you. And that's all what happens for the rural people. The other, quote, intolerable or coercive act that really tipped it off was the Massachusetts Government Act, which yanked away the charter and took away they had quite a bit of self-government, and it took it all away. I won't go into the details of it. But it really pissed them off, and they rose up as a body and rebelled. And it was really the most complete popular revolution in the nation's history. And it was successful. It worked. Like that was September 6, 1774, no more British authority ever in Worcester, Massachusetts. Different court dates for the different other counties, the same thing happened. It was 12 years later, they tried to mimic that with the, quote, Shays Rebellion, and it didn't work so well. They didn't have as many people, the people were more divided, and they got suppressed. But the idea that this most successful revolution in the nation's history and ground up revolution has just been ignored. Actually, that's what inspired Founding Myths, my next big books. When I realized that, I told the full story of that in the first American Revolution, and then I said, wait a second, who's the gatekeeper here? Who is the gatekeeper? If this story's not told, something's going amiss about how we're selecting our stories. And that led to Founding Myths, which is another book. We're not talking about it here. But this is just an example of how common people can and do really propel history forward. Oh, that was the chapter 1. I'm talking about them in chapter 1. Okay. Okay, well, it's one at a time. Fighting men and boys. Pretty obvious that we should say something about the common soldiers of the Revolution. I mean, that's they're the ones who did the fighting, and their experiences are very different than their officers. What happens when people get defeated? They get taken prisoner by the opposing army, and then what? Who goes where? Well, the officers, they get taken to one place and sort of basically wined and dined by their fellow officers, and they promise not to fight for a certain amount of time or this or that, and their lifestyle isn't appreciably changed, and then within a period of time they're generally paroled. The common soldiers, they get thrown into these god-awful prisons. The famous Jersey ship was the worst, the biggest, the worst, but and there were actually more people died in prison than in battle in the American Revolution. Who's dying in prison? It's the officers aren't dying in prison. The common people are. Who's getting shot on the front ranks? I mean, you look at the casualties and how many people of those officers, how many people are common folks, common soldiers. So you really have to tell their story. Now, back to the question that you asked earlier about data or nothing. And the data, data is data, but what I said, we got to personalize this. So that's why I chose 5 individuals and to kind of follow their experiences. And I do this in so many of my books, that if you follow the experiences of a diverse group of individuals, you really start to reconstruct history from the bottom up.
Mhm.
And not just, that's not the social sense I'm talking about in a pedagogical sense. You start with individual experience, and then you build on that until you see sort of the patterns.
A group of students I have, a population of students that I have, and a lot of people have now in Massachusetts anyway, are Latinx students. And so the Hispanic story and the interaction between Hispanics, particularly New Orleans, the war in the West, the war in Florida, what that impact is on the revolution, is a story that it provides another voice. That's a voice that's not in your book, particularly. Is there a reason for that, or is that something that's now evolving and is new? And again, I'm not trying to sort of put a fight side. Why didn't you put that in there? But there's a choice there.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go through very briefly the ones that are in the book, and then that's a great question. A great question. If you start, the first chapter, I'm looking at before the revolution and who's propelling this thing, and I'm seeing that's why the rank and file. Then there's the fighting men and boys. Well, that certainly raises the question about the other half of the population, right? And what are they doing, and how are they participating or not participating in this? And for every soldier that's going, there's women in that soldier's family left at home who's not going, and what the heck are they doing, and how are they dealing with all this? And so obviously I'm going to be talking about women there as a group. I mean, there's no escaping that. And my conclusions were a little different than some people. Some people like to kind of think, oh, if we can find a couple of women who like masqueraded as men and joined the army, then we'll be talking about women. But that's an idiosyncratic thing, and there's a couple of them. But I mean, what's happening to 50% of the population? To me, that's a bigger story, and that's what I really focus on. And once again, there's a class thing going about common people or not. Women who were ladies were not raped. Common women were raped. That kind of thing. Anyway, a lot is made about the loyalists in the American Revolution, and of course there's that famous quote from John Adams: 1/3 loyalist, 1/3 patriot, and 1/3 neutral, which was totally out of context, and it was done. You can read about that in the book. And anyway, once the revolution started, that wasn't the breakdown at all. But they're all the idea of who is a loyalist, and I realized, wait a second, there's this image that all the loyalists were these kind of upper class British kind of office holders type or something. And, there were tenant farmers who were loyalists, who were rebelling against their landlords, who were patriots. And in the back country, there were, quote, loyalists, but they had nothing to do with the king, really. Basically, there was a civil war in the South, and half of them were, quote, loyalists and half not. And you get this great complexity of a torn population and people having motivations all over the map. So within that group of loyalists, there's several subgroups. That's just a very generic term that people recognize. And what I was trying to do is break it down to see all these different subgroups. And then also, I mean, there was very little attention been made to pacifists, but like 1 in 30 people in those times was a member of a religious pacifistic organization. So that to me was a very underrepresented group. And then let's see and then we have these two large groups of population, Native Americans and African Americans, who basically, they kind of held the balance of power. I mean, there was a lot, the whole revolution in the South cannot be understood without the fear of Southern white plantation owners thinking that the British were going to basically free their slaves. And how the enslaved population reacted to that, I mean, that's, as I say, they're the balance of the power. In the West, Native Americans, they were choosing allegiances, and how they decided to do that was huge. and then the impact on the Native American population. I mean, we talk about, quote, Indian wars. Well, if you use that term, Indian wars, the American Revolution was by far the largest Indian war in the nation's history, because every Native American nation and every Native American person was actually directly impacted by the revolution. So those were must includes. Now, why did I not include the Hispanics population? And the answer is pretty easy, which is this: I did my research in the 1990s. And remember I was saying this was an emerging thing, and the scholarship, was fairly recent, and it hadn't caught up. And if you look at all the really good work like this great book now, Catherine Duvall, Independence Lost, which really gave a nice perspective. Once again, she did my kind of thing where she does it through individual people. We have very similar style, and that research was just, that hadn't really come to the fore yet. There might have been a couple of scholarly articles that I had missed, but most of the research is since that time. And now, of course, if I were to rewrite that book, I would have a chapter on the war in the Southwest. I kind of like most of my West, anyway, the Southwest was ignored. And part of that is a kind of a regional chauvinism, and which I was, as a product of my time, I was subjected to that, an involuntary participant in the regional chauvinism that ignored the Southwest.
I think that's a great model for our students to see how history is evolving, and how, as the new stories emerge, the new methods of thinking about history from the bottom up, other groups people become aware of, and that gives new life. So, I wasn't trying to do it.
I'm going to say another thing that's really changed in recent years, and I'm actually part of this change, is the focus on the revolution as an international war, and that this was very a subset of the global war, which was fought all over the place. And I do treat that in Founding Myths, the concluding chapter of Founding Myths about after Yorktown. And so once again, when people are at war, it's not just the elites that are at war. I mean, who's fighting the war? So there are populations all over the globe that are actually impacted by the revolution. So if I were to do it again, I might talk about the uprisings in India that were happening at this time, and how that was playing out. You can't understand the British military history of the revolution without understanding all the other fronts which they were fighting in. They were fighting in the Caribbean. They had to defend the English Channel, the Cape of Good Hope, over in India, in the West Indies. They were fighting all over the globe, and so you can't understand the war without what's happening everywhere. Evolving scholarship, it's great.
So thinking about, I'm thinking about this book.
What's the title?
It's Jonathan Israel's book. Jonathan Israel's book, The Expanding Blaze, How the American Revolution Ignited the World. Again, putting it in a global context, but a book that's rather thick for high school students to read.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of great research being done. Oh, well, if you get involved with history on the individual level like that, like I do, you get quite a treat, because you get these aha, most fascinating moments all the time. And so many times, I'm actually doing my own family history now. And I'm just, it's what a blast. I'm meeting people, that are related to me somehow. And I say, holy cow, and I'm sort of comparing my experiences from this generation with that and everything. And it's just like, I'm going to answer your question later, but before I give a single time, I really wanted to let you know that it's really the fascination. It's kind of like a way of life. History for me, it's like getting pretty philosophical here. Watch out. But You know, I am an individual creature, and I'm sort of in my own world and sort of, in a sense, trapped within my own world and have my own set of, you know, parameters that I'm dealing with. One way that people have kind of out of their own world and their own small world is they travel and they go to different cultures. My son is now teaching in Uganda. He and his wife and our family are at the International School of Uganda. And a little hard for us, by the way, but they just visited for a week and now we don't get them for another year. You know, but boy, is their world expanding. It's amazing. And so where I'm going with this, as you might be able to detect, is history is travel.
Right.
You know, traveling to distant places. And you are traveling to distant places that you do not know. By the way, when you do travel to a distant place that you do not know, you have to realize that you don't speak the language. And you cannot just go there like somebody who thinks he knows what they're talking about. You have to kind of like suspend your own world as best you can and try to get into their language. So history starts with the admission of the unknown. And then you try to get as much experiences as you can. And so basically, that's kind of why I like to do history through individuals. And for instance, I talked earlier about the interplay between bottom-up history and top-down history. And so I realized this after my first few books. And so the book Founders, which is a sweeping history of the whole revolutionary generation from, you know, actually from Washington at Jumonville Glen in the French and Indian War, 7 Years' War until the Constitution. And so, what I did is I told it through 7 individual stories, because I know people like those stories and I like them. But I have a Washington and I have a common soldier. Of course, I choose Joseph Plum Martin for those revolutionary people. If anybody out there in your revolutionary world has not read Joseph Plum Martin's narrative, just do it. Yeah. Just do it. You want to get a feel for the times and for the common soldiers. I mean, it is just the ultimate classic. It's way more than just a personal narrative. You just dive into that time so deeply and thoroughly. So anyway, I took 7 characters, you know, from different points. I wanted to do, I asked myself, who's the most powerful civilian in the country then, since, you know, and it turned out it was a no-brainer. Robert Morris was. He actually ran the country for a while. Who knows about him? Well, he was this rich guy and he kind of bailed out the country from bankruptcy and he ran the place. Well, how am I going to counter him? So I get this kind of, the closest we have to a traveling, flaming revolutionary, kind of like a Trotsky, and that's Dr. Thomas Young, who is in the revolutionary in like 7 different places. Anyway, history from the bottom up. So all these individual stories, the most compelling story for me, the aha thing, was that revolution before the revolution that I talked about before. And the idea that history can be so off base if you don't look deeply enough at what regular people are doing, that you actually, you just don't get the story. And my wife and I actually just finished a book called this a couple of years ago, The Spirit of 74. And our premise was this: I had already told the story of that revolution in the First American Revolution. I'm talking about 1774, the people all over Massachusetts throwing off British rule well before Lexington conquered. And we take 2 iconic events. The Tea Party, which actually set this off, because the Tea Party triggered the coercive acts. The coercive acts triggered the response to the coercive acts, which was overthrowing British rule. Once British rule was overthrown, Britain says, well, what are we going to do? Just let it be? Or do something about it? So everybody knew they weren't going to let it be. They were going to do something about it. So they prepared to do something about it. And then eventually they do something about it. You have Lexington and Concord. Without understanding that overthrow in 1774, there is no link between these 2 iconic moments. You just don't get it. And so the idea that you can actually have the entire story of the revolution told for generations, centuries, without featuring the iconic link that actually triggers the revolution is just, it's mind-boggling to me. And I'm pleased now that something is that beginning a little bit at a time, that story is getting to inch into some of the textbooks. Throughout Massachusetts now, people are owning it, and they're sort of celebrating it, as you guys well know. And but I think that's a signature thing, that if you don't look at what's happening sort of with everyday people, you might be missing one heck of a lot.
Ray, I just coincidentally, I met a few weeks ago with the state senator from Sutton about Revolution 50 commemorations. And he said, you know, in 1774, 500 men from Sutton marched to Worcester, and didn't know that there were that many men in Sutton. He wants to recreate that.
Yes,
is really, I mean, it's inspiring, and you've really disrupted the narrative we have and shown us where we can go with this. But my question, it seems more prosaic. What do you tell a teacher who has maybe a week to cover the revolution? And how do we do this in a way that's going to not just reading the dates, but...
That's a perfect time for me to plug my lesson plans. Okay, great. Okay, so I've worked with this group called ConSource, the Constitutional Sources Project, and developing lesson plans. And my idea, my pedagogy is basically students learn best when they enter into whatever characters they're studying. And this can work on the 5th grade level, the 8th grade level, the senior high school level. If you actually try to become the characters, you will get the point a lot more. How do you become a character from a prior time? You have to have some contextual, whoops, oh, there we go, I see it, yeah. You have to have some contextual information given to you. And for starters, so you can, put down your iPhone and like, okay, I'm gonna enter this world. So I present some material, and then I have people looking into, basically, becoming the characters at a pivotal moment, at a very pivotal moment. And now, where you are now, let me just take you back on the screen. You're at the ConSource website, and all you have to remember as a teacher, just ConSource, it stands for the Constitutional Sources Project, or if you type that in, or ConSource, it'll come. Then tap on, right on the home page, it has a thing that says lesson plans. It's one of the 4 main spots on the home page. So you type on and then the lesson plans will put you to this page right here. And now you scroll down this top. These are, I don't know what those lessons are, but they're not my lessons. So anyway, these are mine. Go up a little bit. Go up a little bit again. Choosing to make a nation. Lessons on the Revolution, Constitution, and Bill of Rights. We haven't done the Bill of Rights yet, but now scroll down there. Scroll down, and I start with the Revolutionary War. Okay, hold up. And by the way, I've also done things all the way down. I have the first ones I'd created were at the Constitutional Convention, and I put people, the students become delegates of the convention, and they actually make these decisions that the delegates had to make. And so I've translated a lot of people's history into individual lessons. Washington's War Council, that's kind of an easy one, because he wanted to, we're in the summer of 75, he wants to invade Boston. He wants to say, I'm getting kind of restless, let's just do this thing. And he convenes his War Council in September, and he says, here's what's good about it, and he kind of presents the case, and the War Council meets, and they make a decision. And so students become that War Council, and it's pretty cool. I'm not going to tell you what they did. Well, you probably know what they decided. They didn't invade it, but students are going to be confronted with that decision. Okay, now let's go back to the main, go back one. There we go. Okay, now the ones that there's the lessons that are going to be relevant for the underrepresented people. There are probably, in particular, the starving soldiers is interesting. It's not, you might want to be interested in that. That's like, basically these people are starving, they haven't they've been total collapse of authority. And This is in 1780, which actually a much harsher winter than the winter at Valley Forge at Morristown. And they've got nothing to eat. And what do they, the question is, do they actually mutiny? Or what do they do? How do they get attention? So the students become that, and they learn what it's like to be in that situation and faced with the thing of like, should I really challenge authority, or how directly should I challenge authority? Now let's go back a little bit. Go back, there we go. A farm wife struggles, Sarah Hodgkins. Now she is featured in People's History, and she's featured in People's History along with her husband, Joseph Hodgkins, who's one of the 5 soldiers that I feature. And the letters back and forth from her to Joseph are just amazing reading. Oh my gosh. The references in there, you can find them yourselves. It's just fantastic. But she starts off being kind of supportive of him going off to war when he's answering the Lexington alarm. But then he chooses to stay, and she says, oh, okay, well then hopefully we make it to the end of the year and then come home. But then he enlists again, and she gets increasingly kind of like upset with his with his enlistments, and the big question is like, how does she deal with this? What kind of pressure can she put on her husband to quit and come home and tend the darn farm? It's getting too hard for her. So it's a very personal look about how the war affects a family, and how women try to affect the lives of the decisions that their husbands are making. Get back again. The Iroquois, this is classic. And actually they have something like this at the museum, Philadelphia, the new Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. But they do a different council than I'm doing. And here, the Iroquois, as you know, there's 6 different nations, and they're deciding, each nation on its own is deciding who to support, if anybody. And so we get into this very complex political decision that people make, and they have to decide who they want to support, who they think might win. You certainly don't want to choose the losing side, or that's going to not be good. And so they actually become this council, this war council, and they are actually given presentations, by agents who are trying to convince them what to do. It makes a very natural kind of situation because, the very nature of the thing is it's a council, and students, can voice their opinions and in the council. Once again, given enough context so that they know to some extent what they're talking about. The next one, enslaved Americans seeking freedom. To me, this is the most fascinating. And this is really my favorite lesson plan ever, because you're placed at Mount Vernon in Washington's plantation, and the British are now, Washington's off, and that's been under colonial control, patriot control, but the British are coming up the Potomac, the river towards them. They're advancing. And the enslaved population on Mount Vernon has to decide, like, what do we do? Do we sit here, or if we now, try to flee to the British, which has its own dangers, there's slave patrols and everything, and we could get killed. But if we do that and we reach the British, does that, will we be free? Or, we think we're going to be free, but is that really true? And what are the dangers involved in fleeing? What are the dangers involved in staying? What if they stay and British take over and they just enslave everybody? But maybe if they won't go to the British, they supposedly think maybe they'll be taught better. It's very dangerous. Do they go alone or with their families? I mean, it's huge. And this is happening. Every enslaved person pretty much throughout the South is facing this decision during the Southern campaign as the British approach their lives. What I love about this is it's not a class discussion like an Iroquois council. This has to be done in small groups, small breakout groups, and here's why. Because the teacher says, one of you is a slave informer. And this was true, I mean, there, some enslaved person got on the good graces of the master by telling him what was going on in slave quarters. And so now, as a student, you have to know, well, somebody's a slave informer. We don't know who. So obviously, they're going to get in groups with their best friends, small little groups, like people they trust, which is exactly the simulation of what had to happen. These decisions were made in very small, intimate groups. And yeah, so you have here a list of the people that, in each of these things, after the lesson, we have the historical outcome, what happened. And here, this is the list of people who did in fact flee. This comes from the foreman at the plantation gave the list to Washington. These are the people who fled. So anyway, I love that thing, and I think it's just loaded. I have another one on with African Americans, the refugees. Since a lot of the people did go to fight with the British, and what happens then, and what happens when the British lose, and a lot of them wound up in Canada. Well, Canada wasn't that great a place. It wasn't that great for farming, and these people continued to basically face a lot of discriminatory actions there. And then here comes the idea of possibly going to Sierra Leone, and so, but that has all its own risks. So again, people are like within that, they're experiencing what the people are experiencing. Anyway, I think you get the idea. There's others here that pertain kind of to the book. The oath of allegiance. Oh my gosh. The pacifist. You're supposed to pledge allegiance, but your religion said you're not supposed to. So basically, are you serving Caesar or you're serving your God? And that's a pretty profound decision to make. All of this is placing students in historical roles and hopefully basically presenting them with buy-in. Okay, they can now I think once you buy into a historical role like this, it's never going to be the same. You're going to kind of get the basic point that people make decisions, and it's not just big political leaders who make decisions, consequential decisions.
This is an amazing resource you put together here. Obviously incredibly rich. I'm so excited to see David George here, for example, but all these other pieces. Just a real practical question. I look at this and I think, I teach juniors at a prep, and most of these say for grades 4 through 8. And I look at these, and I haven't looked at them in any more depth than what you've shown us here. And I think, well, these certainly could be expanded, perhaps, again, because I don't know what exactly is here, or maybe appropriate. I wonder if you're shooting a little low, that in fact these could be for high school students. Many of these topics are the kinds of things that would fit well in a high school class. But again, I haven't looked at the depth, the reading level, the kinds of questions you're asking, the kinds of things that you're doing. And teachers, of course, at the level where I teach, they're gonna, we're gonna have kids write a more sophisticated essay, perhaps, than you're having them right here. I don't know, but again, I'm struck by 4 through 8.
Okay, I'm going to answer that question by saying, let's see, it's pretty late Eastern time, isn't it? So I'm not going to contact my supervisor, my editor at Consource today, but I will tomorrow, and I will say, hey, come on, this is ridiculous. Now, the genesis of why it's for 8 is because the rest of those are at a pretty high level. They're really only available for juniors or seniors. There's Constitution stuff, and it's just higher. And so I tried to make these accessible for 4 to 8. But to say that they're really, it's not like we haven't really dumbed down the language that terribly much, or simplified it. So anyway, so I will wait till tomorrow. We got to change that. Thank you. History is an evolving project. Pedagogy is an evolving project. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think we've reached the hour, and I really want to thank you for your time and your insights and your contributions to history in general and to this Content Institute. It's really fascinating and really interesting. I'm still on chapter 2, but I'm going to be reading the rest as we move along this summer. And really, thank you so much.
I'm going to say one thing in conclusion here, which is that you know, sometimes you think, well, it might be kind of cheating to skip to the end, but you know, for the students, you might take a look at that closing chapter even in the beginning, because it does really say why it's so important, and that actually it might even motivate people a little bit to get deeper into the other chapters. And because the American Revolution, it's always true that people play a part, but the American Revolution really uniquely, in terms of other historical movements, was a total population. It just involved absolutely everything, because every act was politicized. Who you bought from, or you know, who you dealt with, you know, it had political consequences. Every daily act had political consequences. So people had no choice but to become essentially political players. And that's always to some extent true in history, but you know, but sometimes it's just brought to the fore. And the revolution is really the case in point, where that is just so obvious that every single act that you do in your life has political consequences. And during the revolution, that's the way it was, because it affected the entire population, their methods of consumption, who they did business with, whether they were boycotting or not, all these kinds of things. So it's, yeah, I think it's a fantastic, aside from any kind of like nationalistic interest you might have in it, I think it's just an amazing epic in human history, where people really, everybody just made a difference.
Yeah. I'll skip to the last chapter.
Thank you.
Yeah, that doesn't mean that you can still read the rest. Please read the rest.
There's a lot of
material. Yeah, yeah. I don't want to, like, you know, give too much license to people. Okay. Well, thank you. It's a treat to see my, you know, what I've put a lot of time and energy into being received, and hopefully, you know, having some impact on education. Thank you for the opportunity.